Okay, I think we're gonna get ready here. All right, good morning. Welcome to the May 19th daily situational brief for disaster and emergency management with an Indigenous focus on Indigenous territories, reserves, lands, Inuit communities, and everything like that. If you need a copy of our daily brief, you can go onto our app and it should be there. If not, I might have to run the workflow again because I was doing some updates to the database today and it might not be on there yet. But if you go to app.hazardscape.com and you can get the full brief there that we're going to go through. There's no cost for it, and it's open to Indigenous communities across Canada. So you just go to app.hazardscape.com, sign up, get a free user account, and you're good to go. It's not a difficult process. We're trying to make it as easy as possible, especially as we look at all of the fire risks across all reserves, Inuit lands, Métis nations. But as of today, this is what we're looking at in terms of fire risk. So significant changes over the May long weekend. It's not as bad as it has been at this point in time in previous years, but you can see right across South Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and then into Atlantic Canada, they saw some increases in fire danger, while BC and Alberta kind of tapered off in some areas to a small degree. And then up in the Northwest Territories, you can see where it really elevated. So if we go back to where we were just before the long weekend, you can see how it's kind of shifted, how it's reduced across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and it's kind of fluctuated a bit in the prairies. But Atlantic Canada is probably the leading story right now because you can see how they kind of shot up and with all the nice weather they had over the May long weekend. So as we continue to watch for reserve lands, Inuit territory, Métis nations, agreed upon settlements and territories, I think now that we're getting into maybe out of the long weekend heading into June, I think with the warmer weather that's coming, we're just going to see a steady increase in the fire danger across the country. And this is the fire weather index right now. So it's a component of the total Canadian forest fire weather index. It's an indicator of intensity associated with the fires. And so it's not too bad. We've got some high elevated areas up kind of in the Grand Prairie region of Alberta, down in the south near Lethbridge, in BC, kind of fairly north of Kamloops. But overall, for this part of the year, the fire weather index is not horrible. It's shaping up to be okay, but again, this is going to change as we take a look at the temperatures, which if we look at the weather across the country for Canada, we're going to start. So this is right now, this is kind of as it's looking at in the immediate. We want to forecast out here a little bit. So we're going to go into, let's see what it's going to look like by Thursday. So not a whole lot. Let me get rid of that one page there. I can zoom in for you a little bit. Not major off the chart temperatures, but definitely going into Friday at this week. If you see across the prairies, a little bit Manitoba, that interior BC, even Northwest Territories and Western Ontario, you can see that through the week we pretty much persist in those, that 20-degree range. And what that's going to mean for the fire risk is it's just going to continue to dry up through those regions, and the fire weather index is going to escalate across the country. So kind of, par for the course. I don't think we'll see, until we get into kind of, this is Saturday is looking pretty good, getting into those higher mid 20s. Even Atlantic Canada by Friday is forecasted to be quite warm. BC, Yukon, northern part of Northwest Territories, kind of hanging in around those, 10 to 19 degree weather. But I think that's going to hold off a lot of the extreme fire weather index numbers, but everything is going to kind of just slowly continue to dry up and get to probably what would be on a fire weather index of between 16 to 22, which when you get into the 30s is an extreme fire weather index. So 16, 20 to 22 is about a mid-range wildfire danger, probably moving into the weekend. But even if we go back to where we were, May 4th, these are those extreme fire weather index areas. Those are going to be the ones that pop off first across BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and into Manitoba. So, we did have some nice cooling weather and precipitation across a lot of the country this last week, but we're going to be getting into, back into our little bit warmer than normal spring weather for the country. And let's just check and see if there's any major, we'll just see if there's any major weather statements going on for anywhere in the country that will give us a bit of an indication. So there are a couple weather alerts right now you can see in Ontario. So this is probably some freezing rain, up to 10 millimeters of ice buildup, that's quite a bit. Snowfall, 10 to 15 centimeters. So still getting some snow in those areas. If we go down to southern Ontario, we're going to get into a heat warning. So 30 degrees Celsius right now, which is, let's go back to, if that picks it up on here for temperature. Let's see, go back in here. Yeah, so if we go back to today, right now, Tuesday, you can see where that extreme heat is kind of picking up in southern Ontario. So by 12 p.m. today, they're going to be in some very hot weather. And if we look at them in terms of fire risk, you can see that's why they're kind of escalating into that 23 to 29. So by the end of today, I imagine it's going to be quite tan to a little bit orange in southern Ontario as we look at those special weather statements. Even if we go over to Nova Scotia, 30 degrees over the next couple of days. So going back to here, that lines up with that part of Nova Scotia. So getting some pretty hot weather in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia area, southern states. But for Canada, that's just going to mean an increase of fire-related risks and hazards through Atlantic Canada. So those communities, this week, we're doing Disaster Recovery Preparedness Week. So after these daily situational briefings, we'll be focusing on some disaster recovery preparedness and what First Nations Inuit communities can do in terms of preparing for disaster recovery, following an evacuation, even following a smoke event where if the fire doesn't get in your community, what kinds of things should a community be prepared for, even in terms of contamination of smoke, the health effects, and things like that. So if you do have any comments or questions, please let me know. I'm just rerunning my daily sit rep because today's did not refresh on the website. So I'm going to run that again. And if you need access to it, you can grab that for free. So I'll just give it a couple minutes here. In terms of the flood hub, so still looking at flood is dissipating finally now within Alberta and Saskatchewan. So we're starting to see the water levels come below where they were. So even in here now, in around, forget the name of that river, can't see the name anyway, doesn't matter, but north of Clearwater River, you can see how the water dangers are, the extreme water is starting to dissipate with no other major flooding. Ontario, they're up here, they're going to get some of that precipitation and freezing rain. So that's going to elevate some of the creeks and rivers across these central parts of Ontario, which it's going to get up into kind of like the warning danger zone. So if you are in this part of Ontario, keep an eye out for increased river flow and creek and water runoff. Even Lac La Biche at Owl River, they're finally starting to dissipate as well in terms of that extreme river forecasting. So yeah, coming into May, as things warm up and dry out, I think we'll see these flood alerts kind of reduce naturally, especially as the snow melt continues and we start to see that warmer weather come into play, which just means now you're going to see the fire weather increase, kind of fire weather index increase. If we hop over, I've got one other map. This is the new fire starts across BC, Alberta, much of the country. Not a whole lot of new starts going on. These ones are still kind of hanging around from those lightning strikes that occurred through a thunderstorm a couple weeks ago. But overall, everything seems to be under control or being held for the major starts. Those were from last year. These were from May 18th. So nothing, again, of significant note over the long weekend. It was a pretty cool and wet long weekend for a lot of the country. So not a lot of fire startups over the long weekend, which is really great news. So I'm just going to see if that report, I don't think it's finished running yet. If we look at kind of reserve lands, Inuit lands, there's another special weather statement. That's all reserve, just those two there. So not much going on. I did get a new, bit of a different map here. I don't know if it's on this one. This one here. So this is a good map because it kind of, we can now look at the fire weather index along with the perimeter estimates. So this is kind of just telling us, if we go, I want to go, that's on the 15th still. I don't know why it's still on the 15th. But this just kind of gives us a good overall view of the fire weather index, and we can start to throw in here reported wildland fires and then active. So this gives us a bit of a look at, you can see where those dry spots are, the higher fire weather indexes, and you can see those clusters kind of hang around a lot of those dry spells. So as we progress here with the weather, you're going to probably see right now where it's all this like light tan to darker colors. That's where we're going to see probably more startups than anything for, you know, the coming weeks, if we do see that kind of increase in fire risk. I'm just going to see if I can get this page. There we go. So luckily, it looks like down in that Toronto, Southern Ontario region, they do start to cool off through the week. But forecasted out till Sunday. Oh, look at that. By Sunday, we're going to see very warm temperatures in the prairies finally as the forecast. So we're going to start getting into those late 20s to 30s by Friday, by Sunday, as per the weather forecast. So yeah, that's where we're just going to start to see this fire weather index really start to increase for June, which is, you know, pretty much expected. But there we go. Okay, so now we've got the May 19th situation report. Yellow heat warning for Toronto and surrounding areas. We're still watching the Kashkuin active emergencies in terms of their state of local emergency for their water and ongoing mental health, or sorry, their water and evacuation. Peguis, they're kind of finally wrapped up in planning major changes to better protect the community going forward. Cooler weather slowed the spring melt and flooding was less extensive than feared. Moose Cree First Nations downgraded to alert level 4, meaning water levels remain high but are no longer at critical levels. And then we have a list of all of the fires burning across the country right now. And anything else? So there's that heat warning for Ontario. A yellow heat warning is in effect, daytime highs near 30 Celsius. Urban Indigenous communities, elders, and those in inadequate housing in Southern Ontario are at an elevated risk. Cooling centers should be confirmed and checked today. So here's a little thing. I did a write-up on cooling center idea. I don't necessarily, I mean, cooling centers are needed for houseless people and groups like that. But where we in Canada need to get to is starting to talk a little bit more about cooling in place, because yes, urban Indigenous communities, people that are unhoused, they need access to cooling centers. But people that live in a condo, a house, an apartment, whatever shelter they're in, we have to start talking a little bit more about cooling in place, because I think this cooling center idea has really kind of taken off, and people aren't going to leave their homes to go to a cooling center. They might go to a mall or a rec center or something like that, but they're not going to go to a designated cooling center. So emergency managers need to start planning for things like cool in place programs where you can learn how to stay cool at home, because nobody's going to go to a cooling center. Drought and wildfire, BC and Alberta areas affected by multi-year drought. Overall severity of the 2026 wildfire season will largely depend on precipitation in May and June, which we're not getting a ton of it. Prairies and Northwest Territories, pockets of severe drought have been recorded in NWT and northern Manitoba, northeastern Quebec, and extreme western Labrador. Communities depending on surface water sources should plan accordingly. So drought risk is quite high for those areas. Baffin land mine expansion, opposition is mounting there. At a press conference in Apex Beach in Nicolowit on May 15th, hunters and trappers organizations from those communities contended that wildlife populations have already declined due to iron ore mining and argued a proposed railway would further damage wildlife. So those are some of the risks we're going to be watching in Nunavut. Grays Bay Road and Port, Inuit concern. So the proposed Grays Bay Road and Port project for Nunavut is intended to unlock critical mineral deposits, but analysis combining Indigenous and Western science identified that most significant caribou harvesting hotspot lies directly in the path. So that's an interesting one because that Grays Bay Road and Port project is a massive project that's being led by Indigenous or two Indigenous organizations which are coordinating it. But there is significant negative effects on caribou herds. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how the Inuit people in Nunavut kind of manage that, as they have a need for that port, but also they don't want to impact the caribou. And then, yeah, this Whitehorse Emergency Shelter, the shelter operator, Connective, announced it's stepping away at the end of July, leaving the Yukon government months to find a replacement. So that's a pretty big news story up there as well. So what can Indigenous families do right now? We have this on our briefing at app.hazardscape.com. It is Disaster Preparedness Week for Indigenous communities. Let me bring that back. There we go. So we do have some tips on what Indigenous families can do now to prepare for evacuations and what they can do in terms of understanding their community's evacuation routes. And then we have a heat safety today. If you're in Toronto, Ontario, Southern Ontario, check on elders and family members who live alone. Check on older adults, those living alone, and other at-risk people in your community. Try to phone them multiple times a day. Make sure that they have water and access to either fans or even if air conditioning if possible. But as that heat warning in Southern Ontario picks up, I think what we're going to see is that fire risk is going to increase as well. So Indigenous communities especially are going to want to be, fully engulfed right now in the emergency planning process around wildfire risk, heat, high heat events, and evacuations, especially too with it being Disaster Recovery Preparedness Week for us. We are working with a First Nations owned company, All About Abatement. So, Kyle at All About Abatement, they do hazardous materials assessments for housing coordinators and housing departments on reserve and off reserve. So they test for lead, asbestos, mold. They focus quite a bit on making sure that on reserve and off reserve homes across all Indigenous communities have an up-to-date hazardous materials assessment. And again, they do all types of remediation in mold, lead abatement. And Kyle, the owner being First Nations, he understands the importance of improving housing on reserve, especially, and just the underfunding that's going on across Canada by ISK for Indigenous communities. So All About Abatement, they sponsor us in doing these daily briefs because they want to make sure that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are getting good information around these hazardous materials, especially following evacuations, floods, and fires. Even if a home isn't damaged by fire, if there is a significant amount of smoke in the area, that can still contaminate a home. And some of the cleaning kits that the not-for-profits give First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities, they are not safe. The cleaning kits do not clean a home. And I've been to a lot of First Nations homes where we've done tape lift tests and found quite a bit of ash, soot, and char in the attics. And the attics are still asbestos or vermiculite. And all of that has to be abated and removed properly, so the mold spores and the asbestos and anything else doesn't contaminate the rest of the home. So we want to thank All About Abatement and Kyle for their support in making sure that these daily briefs on wildfire risk across all Indigenous communities are provided. And then Kyle does a lot of work as well with Premier Fire and Flood. They're a Canadian-based remediation company. Premier has a really good process for managing pelts, leather drums, beadwork, moccasins, whatever soft goods are contaminated in a home. I've got a YouTube video up of their process where they work with elders and Indigenous cultural liaisons across so many different communities. They can stop the contamination of mold on a leather good or beadwork or a drum or any type of wall hanging. So Darcy at Premier Fire and Flood Restoration, they do a lot of school restoration too. And if you know, on reserve schools, they often have cultural rooms. They have a lot of artifacts, ceremonial items, traditional items. They work with the school cultural liaisons and elders to get all of those items collected and in a state where the mold or the fire contamination no longer penetrates those items, and they clean it really gently. So Premier Fire and Flood is also a sponsor of ours. They're helping us to educate Indigenous communities across Canada on recovery preparedness, what to look for in terms of making sure fire smoke contamination is dealt with, sewer backup, water, humidity, moisture, and mold. They also have a 50-foot rapid response trailer that can be deployed to any community, whether it's directly on a road or if they have to stage it to fly things in or barge them in across a river. They have a 50-foot mobile response trailer ready to go to any Indigenous community. And again, if you go to my YouTube, you can see a video on that. But this is probably the biggest thing I would say to Indigenous communities and emergency management coordinators, especially on reserve. If you haven't gotten a restoration and recovery plan sorted out yet for your community, having a sort of first response in terms of restoration is really important. It can save a lot of damage to cultural items. So thank you to All About Abatement. It's First Nations owned, Kyle and Darcy at Premier Fire and Flood for sponsoring these briefings. And they're also helping to keep the costs low for our youth programs, on reserve training for youth programs, and other Indigenous programs and training. Their sponsorship helps with that as well. So thank you to Kyle at All About Abatement and Darcy at Premier Fire and Flood Restoration. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the comments. I'll show you a really quick test here of what we're doing on our learning library for Indigenous emergency coordinators. This is something that we're trying out to see how it works for a learning course. We have our Keeping Our People Safe, Helping Our People Recover emergency management training. And you can now go into this module and follow along the story of Lynx River. So if you're a North of 60 fan, you might appreciate Lynx River. But our course this is an introduction and support to our in-person community training on emergency management coordinator training for Indigenous communities. And this is something that you can use to work towards a certificate. And it helps you kind of walk through an engaging way on how to learn about emergency management and emergency response through an actual community setting. So through this story, you're kind of new to the community. You are walking through the community with the chief as a new emergency management coordinator for Lynx River. So a hazard here is a source of potential harm, flood, fire, and extreme cold. An incident is an event caused by a hazard that requires a response, and an emergency is an incident that exceeds normal departmental capacity. So you'll walk through this story, right? And it talks to you about, the council wants to know what your first priority will be as a new emergency management coordinator on reserve. And it gives you some options here. And of course, you want to start by reviewing plans and assessments that already exist. And then it talks about how you're, reviewing the flood the evacuation plan, and you notice that part of the evacuation route goes through a flood zone, and that plan has never been updated. So what are your courses of action? Do you flag it in writing and schedule a revision? Do you update it yourself, or do you note it mentally and keep reading the plan, right? And whatever you click on, your document the gap in brief, memo to chief, and book a plan revision with Public Works and emergency coordinator. That is the correct process. Documented, tracked, and aligned. And you kind of go through this training course. You learn about how increased hazards, increased vulnerability, and a lack of coping capacity increases your risk. And you can adjust these for different risks to kind of learn about the impact on the community. You talk about how mapping your flood zones and your community core using GIS is important. And then you can reflect a little bit on your community's situation. And so all of that goes to your emergency management coordinator role. That is something we're building out. This is going to be full of units as I get to building these out. And you'll go through our full emergency management course through this app, but then you'll also have the in-course materials, and you'll also work in conjunction with the actual assessments and with the actual emergency management plans. So as you go through the course and as you go through your own community planning process, you can do that all on here in complementary with the in-course work that we do. And we've got a youth program that's developed right now that ties emergency management in with guardian training. So if you have youth that are going through the land, water, fire, whatever guardian training your community is focused on, we're working with One Nation to incorporate emergency management into that guardian training program. And that's so the youth can get involved. The youth get access to the training. They get access to this application. They get access to the resource library where we host all of our links to all of our data sources. And they can also read the situational briefings and get a sense of, strategic high-level briefings for chief and council. So youth get some pretty practical hands-on experience as they go through this emergency management training program. So if anyone has any questions on that, feel free to contact us directly and we can send you those program details and talk to you about how we're doing the youth training, the emergency management coordinator training for on reserve, off reserve, and for all Indigenous communities. The drought monitor won't be updated for a little while, but no, it's kind of where we're always at. But I guess, yeah, the big stories right now are just those special weather statements sort of in Eastern Canada with the hot weather in Halifax, Southern Ontario, and then getting a little bit of freezing rain and snow in central Ontario, but no other major weather issues right now. And then just looking again at the forecast. So getting into the end of the week, you're going to see where it really warms up in the prairies and sort of that central BC. But for today, the hot spot is going to be Ontario and that Halifax area. So yeah, lots to watch. Since it is Disaster Recovery Preparedness Week, I can show you too on here. We do have a separate disaster recovery planning hub. And what First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities can do now for disaster recovery is they can start a pre-disaster planning and preparedness assessment just for recovery. And what this does is it takes you through the 7 recovery capitals on all of the areas that a community needs to focus on for disaster recovery, being the natural environment, land, water, ecosystems, community networks, social cohesion, economic resources, employment, local economy, cultural identity, strengths, traditional knowledge, ceremonial practices, the governance structure of the community, leadership capacity, the physical infrastructure, housing, utilities, and then the community health, skills, education, capacity, mental well-being. All of these pieces can be done and sort of sorted out now through community meetings, right? We provide a list of considerations for emergency management coordinators to talk to elders, staff, community members about, right? So for example, what community organizations, networks, groups, and informal support structures exist within your nation that might need to be called upon or activated for disaster recovery, or even just to include in your planning for emergency management, right? How strong are relationships and trust within the community, right? You can go through and capture all of these baseline bits of information on community strengths, recovery priorities, right? Financial current state, key assets. What are the gaps and vulnerabilities in your finance section? So if your on reserve or off reserve finance team for your nation has never been through $100 million or $200 or $300 million disaster recovery, what are some of the things that you might want to get in place now in your planning? So if you have to scale up that department, you can get that done, because scaling up a finance department to manage a $500 million recovery, there's a lot you can do now, and there's a lot that you can have in place. So if that has to occur, your finance team, your housing team, public works, capital, infrastructure, all those teams across all of your nation departments are ready to go. And you do that for all of these. And basically you get a full report with some critical gaps and priority actions. And this is your disaster recovery preparedness plan. And that's where we specialize in. But it's all part of the full emergency management program assessment anyway. And that falls within this planning context. So if you are looking to kind of understand the Indigenous emergency operations planning environment, and you have coordinators or other staff in your departments that need training on that planning process, we do that in person, but we also do it alongside the app, because in our training, it's more like a workshop. And I'll say that because you are being trained on terminology and process and modern day emergency management, but you're also doing the planning and the work in the class. So you walk out with a hazard, risk, vulnerability assessment for your community, strategic plan, emergency plan that you can then take to the community for input. So that's where we're focused as of our process right now. But if you do have any questions, please let us know either through comments, or you can email us at support@hazardscape.com. You can DM us on Facebook or leave a comment. If you do want access to all of this, it's free for all Indigenous communities. And we've also are embedding a token system. So as communities do the training and as they help us build out this app, First Nations, Métis, Inuit can earn their costs back on their emergency management program. And there's nobody else that's doing that in Canada. You can't get, what other consulting firm across Canada is going to emergency departments in First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities and saying, hey, the more you work with us, the more training you do, you can actually reduce your consulting costs or your fees. There's no consulting company doing that. So if you partner with us as a Indigenous community, and you have some staff go through and get their certificate for emergency management, and they help contribute to this application, your community earns tokens, which then reduces the cost for your emergency management support and training through us. So there's no one else doing that across Canada, and that's just part of our reconciliation strategy and trying to get to a sustainable model where communities can now apply to Indigenous Services Canada through Emergency Management Assistance Program and actually not have to ask for tens and tens of thousands of dollars for consulting costs. And with this, you get a grant rating tool. So this writes grants for EMAP and the non-structural mitigation program based on everything you've done. And even when you do that, you can earn tokens as you help if we partner with your community. So I know for a fact communities that were asking ISK for $50,000 just to pay for a consultant, just for their labor costs, you can now get that same level of support for under $2,500 a year if you come onto this system. And you get mentorship and coaching and all of the training, and it's you can earn money back for your community to save costs on your emergency management program, so you can put money towards fire equipment. Why should a First Nation, Inuit, or Métis Nation have to pay $50,000 to a consultant who lives in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, or Toronto, where that money is only going to flow into those communities, when that 50 grand could be used to purchase actual firefighting equipment, emergency preparedness equipment or tools, emergency operations equipment. Like, it's ridiculous that consultants are charging hundreds of dollars an hour for emergency management planning services and support, when First Nation communities, all Indigenous communities, they have the ability in their own communities to do it. They have it. They just need a little bit of extra support in some of the training and terminology to be, to work within the federal system. Some of them don't even need that, but the ones that do, your money can be spent elsewhere on more productive things for your community than paying a consultant $150 an hour to only have to go spend that money in Toronto, while you can earn money that actually can be used within your community. So that's kind of my spiel on our Indigenous Emergency Management System. And I'm actually going to be driving. I'm getting out from this desk for the summer and going to be driving to many communities across Canada to give them presentations and to meet with them. So if your community is looking for a presentation, stay tuned on our TikTok and our Facebook, because I'll be announcing kind of where the regions I'll be traveling in. And if First Nations want me to pop in, or in Inuit communities, if I can get there, or even Métis Nations, will come and do some presentations, workshops, small workshop sessions or introductions, whatever it is. But yeah, we're going to be focusing on the wildfire risk for Indigenous communities and the impacts, and just trying to help nations sort of, cope better with all of the risks and hazards that are present. Because with the heat that's coming this summer and next summer through El Nino, with the fire risk that still is going on, it's not going to be so much about emergency management going forward. It's going to be about adaptation. And adaptation is really the big push that Canada needs to be focusing on right now, because the emergencies are here, the disasters are here, climate change is on us. It's not going to suddenly stop. Adaptation for every community across Canada, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we just focus on Indigenous, adaptation is going to be the critical function that needs to go on across the country. So if you are with an Indigenous community and you want a presentation, I will be working remotely, because we work with communities that, our work has impact with communities, and we need those communities at the table to talk about the impact, and for us to really understand the impact, so we can help create better tools and better training and better engagement with those we work with. So that's a bit of what we're going to be doing this summer as well, getting out on the road to meet with different communities. So unless I get any questions or comments or anything, that's kind of where I'll leave today's briefing. I'll be back tomorrow with a new daily briefing. This one gets updated in our app every morning. So if you want to access this, you can also download it by Word. So if you want to share with Chief and Council your leadership, if you want to brief your own leadership on what's going on in terms of hazard risk across the country, you can download this briefing and present it under your community context, culture, your nation's logos, whatever you want to do with it. It's yours if you want it. That's just something that we're able to provide through our sponsorships with First Nations owned All About Abatement and Canadian owned Premier Fire and Flood Restoration. They're making it possible for us to do these in daily Canada emergency situation reports, and to have Indigenous leadership download them at no cost in a Word document, and you can brand it for your executive leadership, elected officials, chief and council, whatever that looks like. And we don't just focus on fire, flood, those kind of risks. We get into policy and funding news around emergency management. We have an Arctic update, especially for Nunavut Inuit communities. We get into missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, 2S plus, all of the social, organized crime, drug, substance abuse risks that are going on in community. We touch on those as well, and then preparedness for Indigenous families. So we're not just focused on infrastructure, buildings, fires, and floods. We're focused on a holistic emergency management program for communities across Canada. And that's what you can get in our daily briefing every day on our lives on Facebook and YouTube. And yeah, and that includes our training. We give the training to Indigenous communities as well once it's been hosted. All right, well, thank you for joining us on this live. And if you had to watch the recording of it, please leave us a comment, a like, and a share so others like you can find it. And I'll be back tomorrow morning for our next briefing for Indigenous emergency management information news you can use as you prepare your communities to to be prepared for climate change and the upcoming hazard season. Take care, everyone, and see you tomorrow.